It's the countries who are more active, countries who in a way have to bridge these divides more often, who would tend to use this term. I don't think every country, for example, of the Global South would necessarily go with it.
Well, thank you very much. Very clear. Now, there is a club, the BRICS. Why this club? And do you consider that the BRICS will expand?
Well, to be honest, why the club? Because there was another club. It was called the G7, and you wouldn't let anybody else into that club. So we said we go and form our own club.
Thank you for these words of introduction. And thank you, Minister, for your presence today in Geneva, a city which has hosted many negotiations about peaceful settlements of international crises, and at WIPO, a key international organization. And thank you for this dialogue with the GCSP. The title, as Thomas said, that you have chosen for this dialogue is Global Tectonics, the Indian View of a World in Churn. Well, I think that we all agree that we are at a time of deconstruction of the world order. And as a European, I would say that three developments are at the core of this deconstruction. Number one, the return of war in Europe for the first time since the Second World War, with the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Number two, the new Cold War, this time between the US and China. And number three, the return of a non-aligned movement, called today the Global South, which practices multi-alignment more than non-alignment. Mr. Minister, India is certainly now a key economic and political actor in this new world. How would you describe its transformation? And in this new context, what is, in your view, the role of India? And again, it's a great honor to be with you this morning and a great pleasure to welcome you.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank all of you for turning up this morning. In a way, perhaps this is a good subject to discuss in Geneva, because if we talk about the future of the global order, talk about the changes, the challenges, the prospects, this is a city where perhaps which has done more than any other to really try to construct, sometimes not entirely successfully, what is a world order, however imperfect that might be. And the fact that it hosts so many UN organizations itself is a testimony to those efforts, and I think it's absolutely the right place to have that conversation. Ambassador, you mentioned three things. You spoke about the return of war in Europe. You spoke about a competition, a great power competition. And you called non-alignment. We call, I mean, there is a non-aligned moment, there's still a non-alignment group, non-aligned group. But I think the Global South is a little bit different. I'd be happy to speak to you about it. But I think you're describing the symptoms. Those are not the causes. What are the causes? I mean, first of all, when the UN, which you can take as the current architecture to the extent there is one, when the UN was founded, it had about 50 members. Okay, today you have 193. Now, if the shareholders of any enterprise have gone up 4 times, how can that remain static? How can it remain in the same position? Now, it's not just that the number of UN members or independent countries have grown. Their relative weight has also grown. That if you look at what were the top 20 economies, let us say in 1945, and then track it every 10 years, you would see a big change. And I think the sharpest change that we have seen in our lifetime is that of China. And the next one which is coming is India, because barely 10 years ago, India was the 10th largest economy. Today it is 5th, and probably by the end of the decade, probably be 3rd. So if the weight, if the numbers have grown, if the relative weight has changed, with that the balances have changed. And then in certain cases, relatively, there's I would say, a contraction as well. I mean, the United States, to name the most obvious example, does not have the dominance which it did in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. It doesn't have, in many ways, the relative capabilities, and most of all, it doesn't have the appetite. So what you have is a world where those who did more are doing less. In many cases, those who have risen faster are not necessarily plugging in the gaps which have been created. The number of variables itself has increased. Many situations, tensions have become more regional, and often the world order says, let the kind of people involved handle it by themselves. And sometimes in this tussle, big forces have been set into motion. So if you look at the return of war to Europe, it didn't happen overnight in February of 2022. I mean, there were a whole set of events which eventually led to it. If you look today at the competition, especially between the US and China, it is in many ways a competition for global primacy. So, and when you look at the reaction of many other countries, especially developing countries, the reason the global south has come together right now, and it was not coincidental, it happened during our presidency of the G20, was a feeling that their interests and their concerns were being neglected when bigger players or different players were busy with their own fights. And therefore, how do I get heard? And when 120 countries come together, you get heard. So I think it made complete sense there.
Thank you very much. It's very clear, but one more question about the global south. What does it mean exactly for India? Is it like the non-alignment before? What do you mean with the words multi-alignment? It seems to me that it's a big difference between the past non-aligned movement and multi-alignment. What is for India the meaning of these words?
Okay, I would distinguish between the two. I think global south, there's you can say a smell test, okay? The countries of the global south know they are global south. They know the global south. Most of them are decolonized countries. Most of them are developing countries. They have today income levels. They have positions. They have geographies which kind of define them. So there is it's like if you have a community, people of the community know that they are in or that they are not part of it, and their interests, their articulation, their sentiments, their solidarity, all of this is reflected in that. So it's, I would say, an intuitive gathering of countries who actually know why they are in that room, and they have a feel for each other. But I would differentiate between that and multi-alignment, because the multi-alignment issue is much more a policy perspective of countries who see in their diplomacy the need to have greater freedom of choices and to exercise those choices when required to do so by their national interest, and do not in this world want to be tied down to exclusive relationships. So they, in their view, and we are a prime example of it, your range of interests has become so broad that you know, on different issues you would have, and sometimes different theaters or regions, you would have different partners, but you don't want any one issue or any set of partners to really exclude others.
Yeah.
So there is that open architecture, you can say, of the foreign policy there. And it's the countries who are more active, countries who in a way have to bridge these divides more often, who would tend to use this term. I don't think every country, for example, of the Global South would necessarily go with it.
Well, thank you very much. Very clear. Now, there is a club, the BRICS. Why this club? And do you consider that the BRICS will expand?
Well, to be honest, why the club? Because there was another club. It was called the G7, and you wouldn't let anybody else into that club. So we said we go and form our own club. You know, so we decided, okay, you know, we are also, you know, good citizens of good standing who have a place in the global society, and therefore this is how typically clubs multiply. So it started, and as it started, like many clubs, it gained a life of its own over a period of time. Others saw value in it as well. So in a sense, I would say, I mean, it's actually a very interesting group, because if you look at it, typically any club or any group has either a geographical contiguity or some common historical experience, or you know, a very strong economic connect. There are some orthodox binding factors. But when you have a Brazil in South America, and Russia in Europe, and India and China and Asia, and later on South Africa was added, the common feature was really, I would say, big countries rising in the international system. Russia perhaps had already risen, so would not necessarily qualify in that, who felt that their coming together would give them greater weight and greater influence. Now, what has happened between when the BRICS started, approximately 2 decades ago, to where we are now, is we see, particularly in the last few years, a lot of interest in you know, countries joining the grouping. We expanded the BRICS. We took the decision to expand the BRICS last year in Johannesburg, and we extended invitations to more countries, which virtually doubled the number. We will be meeting soon in Kazan next month. And we know, I mean, as I travel around the world, I frankly see more and more enthusiasm, you know, more interest really in countries wanting to be associated in some form or the other. BRICS, of course, has itself evolved. I mean, in all of this, we've also created a bank, the New Development Bank. I think in on different issues, we have collective positions, but there are many issues on which our interests also diverge. I mean, India and Russia and China and Brazil, South Africa would not, you know, necessarily agree on all issues, and in certain cases, maybe our positions can be quite divergent.
Yes, thank you very much. No, I noted what you said about the G7. I fully agree with you. But since then, the G20 has been created during the financial crisis, and it was a good answer to a difficult moment. And that's why, considered maybe from the north, we don't see why the BRICS was necessary, given the fact that the G20 exists. But I heard your answer.
Yeah, but you know, I must tell you, I'm still struck by how insecure the North is when you speak about the BRICS. Somehow, something seems to get under people's skin. Yeah. And you know, and here's an observation: you know, if there is a G20, did the G7 disband? Has it stopped meeting? No, it still continues. So if the G20 exists, the G20 is there, but the G7 still exists. Then why can't the G20 be there and the BRICS also exist? So we're all constituents. I mean,
yeah, excellent answer as always. Thank you very much. Of course, one key question is about the relationship between India and China. We have seen difficult moments in the Himalaya on the border. We see a kind of competition in the Indian Ocean. How would you describe the relationship between China and India?
I'll need a lot of adjectives. I mean, it's definitely a very complex relationship because if you look at it, these are two civilizational states. They have a long history. They are also states who, at various points of time in history, were very big in the global economy, in the global society. They had bad periods in their history. Both of them are reviving, are rejuvenating in a way. And also as civilizational societies, they are, their borders, their identity, their interests, these are getting, more sharply defined, which happens in a more modern age. And they are the only two countries which have a population of more than 1 billion. And what happens normally when any country rises is it has ripple impact on the neighborhood. Now these two countries also have the singular honor of being each other's neighbors. So each one's rise has a ripple impact. They have a common neighborhood as well, and they are neighbors to each other. So if you look at all these factors, and they have different political systems, they have different economic systems. So if you take the totality of this, you can understand why I selected a safe but expressive word like complex. We had, we've not had an easy relationship in the past. It began reasonably well in the late 40s. There were frictions in the 50s. There was a war in 1962. Then there was a period really from the late 50s till for about 15 years we didn't have an ambassador. We sent back an ambassador in 76. But it was only in the late 80s that really the relationship, you can say, normalized. Now the basis for the normalization was that because we have a disputed border, the entirety of the border, which is almost 3,500 kilometers, is disputed and is being negotiated. So the basis, obviously, for a good relationship, or I would say even a normal relationship, was that there would be peace and tranquility in the border. So after things began to take a better turn in 88, we had a series of agreements which stabilized the border. Then trade began, more contacts, politicians, generals, tourists, all what normally neighbors do. Now what happened in 2020 was that, in violation of multiple agreements, for some reason which is still not entirely clear to us, we can speculate on it, the Chinese actually moved a very large number of troops to the line of actual control at the border. And naturally, in response, we moved our troops up. It was very difficult for us because we were in the middle of a COVID lockdown at that time. They had come out of COVID, that first round of COVID. Now, we could see straight away that this was a very dangerous development because the presence of large number of troops in those extreme heights and extreme cold in near proximity could lead to a mishap. And that's exactly what happened in June of 2020. So the issue for us is, why they have disturbed that peace and tranquility, why they moved those troops. And how do you now deal with this very close-up situation? So we've been negotiating now for close to 4 years. And the first step of that is what we call disengagement, which is that their troops go back to their normal operating bases and our troops go back to our normal operating bases. And where required, we have an arrangement about patrolling, because both of us patrol regularly in that border, because as I said, it's not a legally delineated border. Those negotiations are going on. We made some progress. I would say roughly, you can say about 75% of the disengagement problems are sorted out. We still have some things to do. But there's a bigger issue that, if both of us have brought forces close up, and in that sense, there's the level of militarization of the border has increased. How does one deal with it? I think we have to deal with it. But in the meanwhile, after the clash, it has affected actually the entirety of the relationship, because you can't have violence on the border and then say the rest of the relationship is insulated from it. So trade has got affected, and the exchanges have got affected. So it is not normal, to put it very politely. We hope that if there is a solution to the disengagement and there is a return to peace and tranquility, then we can look at other possibilities. So that is the immediate issue. But I think there are larger issues in respect of India-China. We have long struggled with the trade issue. I've been ambassador in China, so I can tell you from my time there that we are talking, 15 years ago, that we feel that the economic relationship with China has been very unfair. It has been very imbalanced, that we don't have the market access there. They have much better market access in India. We have concerns today, again, this is autonomous of the border situation in various areas, technology, in telecom, in digital, and those are issues. And now, as you've said, we also do monitor very carefully what happens in the Indian Ocean. So for us, any radical shift or change of presence in the Indian Ocean is something we will take into our security calculus.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. And I think you are the best one to explain all this, which is so important for all of us, because not only you've been ambassador to Beijing, but you speak Chinese.
Well, no, I would pass up on that. Yeah.
Now, in this context, there is a rather new organization, the Indo-Pacific Quad, with the US, India, Japan, and Australia. What is the role of this institution? How do you see the possibility maybe to enlarge it?
This is one more club.
Exactly.
And it's, every club has a purpose, every club has a context. It restarted because it was first attempted in 2007 and didn't work out for some reasons. Then in 2017, after a 10-year gap, it was restarted. And it has done well, because it was started at the level of the Secretary General, Permanent Secretary level. In 17, it became ministerial in 19, Foreign Minister, and then in 21, it has become Prime Minister or President level meeting. It has also created a very large number of activities and outcomes and collaborative initiatives, and these span a very broad range. It from 5G technology to connectivity to maritime domain awareness to providing vaccines to giving fellowships to doing HADR operations together. So I would say today there would be at least maybe 25, 30, maybe even more than that, different clusters of activities under the Quad. Certainly from our foreign policy perspective, it's been a very big addition to the sum total of what we do globally. We hope in the coming days that we will have a Quad summit in the US. So that also tells you, how important in a way it has become. If you ask me why did it happen, again, as I said, these four countries who are market economies, who are political democracies, who in many ways have common approach to international relations, at least, and are comfortable with each other, felt that our coming together would stabilize the Indo-Pacific region, would create a climate of predictability and stability and security which is necessary for continued growth and prosperity there. And I think when I look back, the last 7 years, I think it was a very good, very wise decision that we took. Initially, like anything new which appears, there were questions. ASEAN countries, for example, wondered what implication does it have for them. But I would say with the passage of time, there is a increasing reassurance in much of the Indo-Pacific that actually this is a net asset to the region. And we certainly intend, and I sense the same with other Quad partners, we certainly intend to intensify it in the times to come.
Thank you very much. So this was looking east. If I look west, there is also a new promising development with the trilateral partnership. I may go a bit fast in mentioning that, but between India, the GCC countries, and Europe, a famous corridor. Mm-hmm. How would you describe the perspectives of these new development? I noted that before coming to Geneva, you went to Saudi Arabia, mm-hmm. and then to Germany. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. We agreed on this corridor last September on the sidelines of the UN, of the G20. Now, it's very interesting. I remember speaking to the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and what he described in many ways was actually, even today, there are townships in Saudi Arabia which remember and have internalized the movement of Indians, and they have names and they have habits and they have dress sort of adoption, which shows really how deep the trade history was in that part of the world. Okay, so the fact is, if you were to, let us say, go back 2,000 years, at that time, I'm using this for convenience, let us say the Roman Empire at one end and India on the other, two big economic centers, would have actually had their trade go through the Arabian Peninsula, cross the Mediterranean and go across, and vice versa. Now, for a variety of reasons, it got interrupted. In some ways, even when it was resumed, it had a modern incarnation. The Suez Canal is one example of that. But today, what has happened, this is a larger point. If you look at the implications of the COVID, if you look at what the anxieties which arise from conflicts, if you factor in the regular occurrence of extreme climate events, what all big economies want to do is they want to de-risk. They want to de-risk their economic exposure. And one important part of that de-risking is to have more corridors, more connectivity. Mm. So this was actually something which came out between us, the Saudis especially, but the UAE was also involved, with some European countries and a very important player. European countries included France, Germany, Italy, which were the United States. But the United States also felt strongly about it and was prepared to contribute to it and underwrite it in many respects. So that's how this idea came about. Now, unfortunately, what happened was soon within a month, the events of October 7th, and then the conflict in Gaza, which started after that. So it has, in a way, I would say there's been a dampening effect in terms of the immediate action, but it's not like nothing has happened. In fact, we have even in Saudi Arabia, for example, I was discussing with them, we are looking at a study on power grids, which we are doing with them. With UAE, we have begun some activities on ports and logistics on either end. So I'll be honest, clearly the Gaza conflict and all the uncertainties have slowed us down, but I think there is a fundamental logic to this collaboration, and at some stage this will take over. So I do expect, as and when things recede, that there will be a big pickup. But even if it doesn't, I think some degree of activities, preparatory activities, would continue. But there is a lot of interest here, and this new connectivity. There are many such enterprises today in the world. That if you look at multi-alignment, for example, we have also a connectivity initiative through Iran and Russia. On the other side, we have a polar connectivity. We even have a land connectivity from India to Vietnam, which we are trying to get through Myanmar. So multi-alignment is also expressed in connectivity today in the world.
Thank you very much. Now, one question about the relationship between India and the European Union. We'll have soon a new EU Commission in Brussels. What is the most important for you, the relationship with Brussels, the relationship with Germany, with France, both? And are you optimistic about the possibility to sign in the coming months, let's say, a free trade agreement between the EU and India?
Well, since you asked the question, I have to say the relationship with France is very important. But it's true, it's a fact as well. And so it is with Germany, which is our largest trade partner. But in reality, what had happened to us, and this is our own, in a way, perhaps analytical or operational deficiency in the past. We largely dealt with the big European nation states, even though the EU became deeper and deeper. So if you looked at Indian foreign policy, say 15 years ago, 20 years ago, it would be centered around a France, a Germany, a UK, perhaps Italy or Spain. Now, that underwent a change over the last decade. So those relationships, bilateral relationships, continue. But we have invested an enormous amount of time and effort with the Commission. I suspect, in my own tenure, probably I've dealt more with the Commission than all my predecessors put together. And that's not because of me. It is because once there is a realization of the importance of the Commission. We've also created mechanisms. We are one of the two countries with whom the EU has a Trade and Technology Council. The other one is the United States. We are seeking to revive our free trade agreement. We had negotiated it. Then there were some problems. It didn't get signed. Then restarting the negotiations was an issue, but it started under von der Leyen. And the FTA, the investment treaty, the geographical indications agreement, these are all right now under negotiations. Am I confident of doing it in the next few months? I thought we were difficult as a bureaucracy, but I can assure you Brussels is a good competitor in this respect. So when two difficult bureaucracies negotiate with each other, I think it would be fair to not press me on a timeline here. But for us, I want to say, Europe as a whole, European Union and Europe, and I'm here in a non-EU country. We did an EFTA with the FTA just a few months ago. If you look today at our engagement, the engagement with the EU collectively has gone up. We have an engagement with different subgroupings within the EU, the Nordics, for example. So we engage the Nordics at the Prime Minister's level. I engage the Nordics Baltics at my level. We engage the Central Europeans as a distinct grouping. We do the Mediterranean. In fact, I just last week had the first India-Mediterranean business conference. So what we have done is we have really stepped up our engagement with Europe, and there are 2-3 reasons for it. One, we do think a stronger partnership can accelerate our national growth and development. Europe has resources, it has technology, it has best practices which would be very useful to us. Secondly, we welcome Europe in a way as one of the poles of a multipolar world. I mean, we do see a strategic awakening in Europe. I think recent developments have made Europeans much more conscious about themselves and the world. And I think that's a net asset really to the world. I mean, we want a strong Europe, we want a more contributing Europe, and certainly Europe with which we'd like a bigger partnership. And third, we find Europe in many ways actually a very forward-looking partner on some of the big issues. Yes, there are some issues on which we have strong differences like CBAM, but by and large, I was in Germany yesterday. We have a green and sustainable development partnership with Germany. There are a lot of projects which have moved forward on that. We are today looking at areas like semiconductors and electric mobility as areas of partnership. It's also, by the way, a very interesting partner in terms of mobility of Indian talent. That if when we look at the world today, increasingly we look at the world as a global workplace. And in that global workplace for us, the legal mobility of people, their fair treatment when they go out in the world, the opportunities that they get there, I think all these are important for us. And this deeper engagement with Europe has actually helped very much in terms of mobility. I mean, we see a certain welcome of Indian talent and skills, and we understand this is happening at a time when there are actually difficult immigration debates going on in this continent.
Well, thank you very much for these very positive words, and I reciprocate. We have exactly the same positive view about the rise of India as a key partner for Europe. You mentioned the mobility of Indian talents, and I'm impressed by the success story of Indian citizens in the US. Mm-hmm. If you look at the list of the CEOs of the most successful companies in California, most of them are from Indian origin, not to mention a candidate to the top job in the US. How do you explain these success stories, and do you see these success stories are transforming the image of India all over the world?
Well, look, I would say the reasons why many Indians have been so successful in the US is that in India itself, India is a very competitive place. So if you grow up in I would say almost a hyper competitive environment, and in a society where really education is the pathway of mobility, then there's a certain mindset which is built into you. coming to a place like the US, where there are opportunities, where there is a performance reward correlation, where there's a possibility of where the hierarchy is less rigid, I think this competitiveness then becomes a great asset. These are people, for them now this environment is really very friendly and very rewarding for all the attributes which they have already acquired in India and brought to bear as immigrants. So I would say in many ways that's, it can express itself in different ways. I mean, you would say we are probably in terms of education, the most qualified minority group or a hyphenated nationality group in the US. But those are derivatives of that fundamental competitiveness. To some extent, speaking English again helps. Indians, by and large, are also much more adaptable. So they are able to adjust. We see that even in Europe. I mean, when I was in Germany yesterday, I got from the German politicians, I actually got a lot of warm words about Indian communities, how well they adjust and contribute, even in small German towns and villages. So I would say that's the fundamental reason, but also bear in mind that this happened, the takeoff point was really the .com revolution, the H-1B visa, the fact that a lot of skilled Indians or technically smart Indians went there. Then they created a pathway, it opened up things, more of them came in. So yes, Silicon Valley, but I would say today if you look at even education, you look at businesses, you look at finance today, I mean every private equity is full of Indians out there. And there are perhaps some cultural attributes as well.
Fascinating. We discussed the different elements of this changing world order, but of course we have not yet discussed Geneva, New York.
Okay.
At the end of September, there will be a summit about the future.
Yes.
In New York. Mm-hmm. And of course it is of major importance for the global issues which cannot be solved by different elements which need that we work together, climate change and so on and so forth. Are you optimistic about this summit at the end of September in New York?
Look, I think a concern for us, which we would like to take into that summit, is that as a result of the COVID, as a result of global economic developments, conflicts, all the stresses on the international system, actually the world has fallen behind very significantly in its pursuit of SDGs. It's a very big concern. Yeah. I travel a fair amount to Africa, and I can, every place I go to, I hear that story of shrinking budgets, of inability to, even keep up the pace which they were doing before the COVID. So we do think that there are some very crucial issues that the Summit of the Future needs to look at. Now, it's not like there are no solutions. I mean, there are solutions. I mean, one which we can offer from our own experience, for example, is the deployment of a digital public infrastructure and what an impact it makes in terms of the quality of governance, in terms of the efficiency of public services, in terms of actually attacking poverty. That today, if in India, we are able, week after week, month after month, to actually target about 830 million people and say, these are the 830 million people who are deserving of food support, or those are the 630 million people who should get free health access. We can only do it because we have a digital backbone that we have painstakingly created. But once you have done something like this, I mean, it's amazing how you can, purpose it for different events. So if you look at it, today our elections are fairer, our public services are better, our corruption is less, the ease of living for people is very different, and all of it is because of this digital. So we think digital SDG issues, global governance issues, resources issues, solutions like, and I'm giving you this as an example, in different areas. So there is a lot there for the world to look at. I'm not in any way diminishing the seriousness of some of the other challenges that we face. Yes, there are very major conflicts going on. I mean, it's a long time in the world where we've had two big conflicts, both of such a large ripple implication happening simultaneously. Yes, it is crucial, but these should not make us forget what are the really bread and butter, life and death issues for a whole lot of countries, and that's really where we want to see that focus.
Yeah, thank you very much. And of course, when I speak about New York and the UN, there is also the Security Council.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, Mr. Minister, the UK and France are very much in favor of the enlargement of the Security Council, including for the permanent members. We think that India should be a permanent member. We think that Brazil, Germany, Japan should be permanent members, and certainly 2 African countries, up to them to decide which one, which is a sensitive issue. Do you think that we will succeed in changing the rules in New York, enlarging the Security Council in both categories?
Well, look, Ambassador, you had far more direct experience of this than I've had. And the reality is there is overall, I think, widespread and deep sentiment for change. Okay. Now, the countries who are opposed to the change, who have a vested interest in the status quo, have actually been very smart about it. So what they do is to diffuse that desire for change. They try to say, let us settle the details before we agree on whether there should be change or not. I mean, that's really putting the cart before the horse. So what happens is you drag it down, and then, if you look at some of these negotiations, the intergovernmental negotiations, for a long time it doesn't have a text. Now, can you show me one negotiation in global history where you actually had a negotiation without a text? I mean, that itself tells you something. So what we have seen is this kind of foot dragging, diversion, it's like we haven't agreed on it. We can't talk about it because we haven't agreed on it. Now it should be the other way around. Unless you talk about it, unless you put proposals on the table, unless you debate it, it's supposed to be a democratic body. People should vote on it. So this idea that something is not possible because all of us have not, consensus, for example, is a concept which is being used as an obstruction. So I think that there is a sense, there is a certain impatience I can see building. And, it's very difficult to predict which way it would go. But, there are many other changes which are also happening. For example, even the idea now that every time you cast a veto, you have to go to the General Assembly and explain it. It's going to have a long-term consequence. So change is going to come. People blocking it, you are really like fighting the waves. But they are doing it. We also need to recognize that and try to find ways of overcoming it.
No, I totally agree with you, and we need the UN in great shape to address the major issues of today and tomorrow. Now it's time to turn to the questions coming from the audience. I have them under my eyes. The first one, and it is said there are many questions on Ukraine. And the first 2 are, in the context of the recent visit of Prime Minister Modi to Russia and Ukraine, and his willingness to work towards a peaceful solution, Could you share anything about these efforts? And the second one, how does India see the China-Brazil common understandings on the war in Ukraine?
I'll put it together. First, let me explain what our thinking is on Ukraine. One, we have always held the belief that while there can be differences and disputes between neighbors, in this era, it should not be settled through war and through violence. Okay. And we have said this publicly. Number two, unfortunately that has happened, but we do not believe that a solution is going to come from the battlefield. Now, once you accept that there will not be a solution from the battlefield, which means neither side is able to decisively impose a verdict on the other, then logically there has to be a negotiation. If there is a negotiation, or when there is a negotiation, then you have to have all the parties or the concerned parties at the negotiation. A negotiation cannot be one party and all its supporters coming together and the other party not in the room. Then it's not a negotiation. So we feel today that a time has arrived when there should be a realization that the continuation of this conflict is hurting both countries, it is hurting the region, it is hurting the world, and the sooner it ends, the better off we all are. But it is not our place to suggest terms and tell them what they should. It's their country at the end of it all. That is for them to decide. So what happened was, in July, Prime Minister Modi went to Russia. It was his first visit to Russia after the war started in Ukraine. He had long meetings, a very, very detailed discussion with President Putin. Many things were said, understood. And before that, a few weeks before that, he had actually met President Zelensky in Italy, in Puglia, at the G7. So he went, so after the meeting in Moscow, there was also a discussion, and the Russian side was open to sharing some of this discussion and some ideas in it with the Ukrainian side. We had already told President Zelensky in June that we were contemplating coming to Kiev, so it made sense then in the month of August to go to Kiev, which is what we did. So we sat down with President Zelensky and his core team, and then we had again a discussion there. In a sense, some of what we discussed here, we shared there, and the other way around. Since then, our National Security Advisor has gone back to Moscow to loop Russia back in on whatever was discussed in Ukraine. So I come back to this proposition that we are not going to get a military solution. If there isn't a military solution, there has to be a diplomatic one, a negotiated one. If there is a negotiated one, the parties have to decide when, where, how, what process, what terms. It's for the parties to decide. We can have a view on it, but it's their call eventually. But in this process, if there is anything that we can do, we can, say, I heard this here, what do you think about it there? Or, there are things which they said to us, but they don't want to tell you this officially, but they would like to know what is your thinking. I think those are possibilities. And my sense, after talking to some European colleagues, including when I was in Germany, because some of the Gulf countries have also been active, Saudi Arabia and UAE in particular, and I was there as well. Even among many of the other, many of our friends and partners in Asia, there is an interest. The world would like a few countries who have the ability to talk in both places, who are not seen as in one country as being in the other party's camp. I think these countries have a possibility today. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, we will not have done any harm. But I think at this time, some interest, some kind of movement, I suspect is in our collective interest.
Thank you very much. Now, next question from the audience. India has been a leader in driving the notion of soft diplomacy as compared to other forms of diplomacy. What are the benefits of this approach, and how does it give India a competitive edge?
You do soft diplomacy for two reasons. One, actually to do good. You're trying to spread things. I would give you yoga as an example, or music. Now, you don't do music because you want a competitive edge. You want everybody to be happy. Okay. You do yoga, you want everybody to be healthy. You advocate millets because you want everybody to be better fed and more nutritious. So I think there's a genuine global good side to the soft power of all countries. Certainly, today we think that there is a lot in our culture and heritage and traditions which, if we explain it, communicate it, and practice it well before the world, we think it will make a big difference. And it may look very small when it starts. I remember the time when Prime Minister Modi, shared with us, this was in 2014, on his first visit to the UN, saying, can we actually get the UN to pass a resolution on yoga? And I must confess in all honesty that the diplomats were more skeptical than he was. But when I now look at it, 10 years later, and I see really what a huge impact it's had across the world. When we do the International Day of Yoga, we actually have from the international date line, one end we beam programs. There's not a single country in the world where there isn't a yoga event. So, or if I were to give you what we did last year, which was millets, because millets was the older grain for many societies. It's a more nutritious grain. Most important, it consumes less water. It grows in arid areas. It has a smaller carbon footprint. So when we started propagating millets, I was actually surprised how much traction, for example, we got in Africa, because most Africans also eat millets. Now it's just that the millet culture, because the wheat and rice were so overpowering, that they drove, the millets was like the poor guy's subsistence. You made it, you ate it, you threw it away. Nobody made it, took it to the markets, made other products out of it, played it up and said, this is great food. So once we started going around the world and saying millets is superfood, look at it. I can tell you there were a lot of others who felt the same, but they needed somebody to start this up. So there's one part of that. But the other part of it is, yes, in all of this you build an image. There's a perception of a country or a society or a people. You had, for example, a perception, Indians, hardworking people, successful, Silicon Valley, look at it. In a way, that's soft power at work. These people, by going there, doing well themselves, have created a collective image of the, hardworking, sort of thrifty, family-centric, contributive, socially conscious Indian. Yeah. So it helps us.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Next question from the audience. Which are the hotspots of geopolitics that causes India the most concern nowadays?
I think that's pretty obvious, the same as everybody else. But, for somewhat different reasons. We've spoken about Ukraine at some length, and if you look at Ukraine, the conflict, and this is actually tells you today how interdependent and globalized and tightly woven we have become. When the fighting started, it had an immediate impact on the world food markets, especially on wheat. Okay, it had an immediate impact on fuel prices. Okay, it actually shifted a lot of the. It created a disturbance in the global logistics, in the global economy, in global finance to some degree. Many of the sanctions which EU contemplated had collateral consequences on other societies. So you actually had, this is not so well realized maybe in this part of the world. Many of the consequences of this conflict were actually felt far, far away. I mean, we looked at our own neighborhood in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was struggling through problems, but those problems were massively, they were like multiplied, because we had just negotiated support for a certain amount of fuel for Sri Lanka to import. The moment the conflict happened, literally, I'm not exaggerating, the amount of fuel came down by half because the cost of fuel doubled. So a lot of the crisis in Sri Lanka, the tipping point were actually secondary or tertiary consequences of what was happening in Ukraine. So my point is, today, in a way you can say conflict anywhere actually can create instability everywhere. It's not so obvious. It's a reflection of that tight linkage we have. And for us today, what is happening in the Middle East, in Gaza, I think is a major concern, because it's affecting shipping. The Houthi targeting of shipping has big consequences. It has radicalization implications. And we have a big community in the Middle East. I mean, if you take the Middle East and the Gulf put together, we would be somewhere around between 9 to 10 million people. So and then of course there's energy, there's a lot of other economic consequences. So my point is, every global hotspot today, I mean, here is the paradox, okay? At one level, because of all those changes I described at the start, there's less global appetite to go and do somebody else's problem. But the fact is that somebody else's problem can come back into your home much faster than you think. And this, I think, is one of the paradoxes we confront, which is the real world, the real economy is more globalized. Unfortunately, the multilateral world is weaker and less globalized. Yeah. And this gap, I would argue, is one of the big concerns. And this is one of the reasons why we need a more effective multilateral system and a more reformed UN.
Yeah, we totally agree on that. And I think all the audience is in agreement with you on that. Maybe last question, if you agree. As a career diplomat, when did you see a significant change in India's foreign policy as India rises?
That's it's not an easy one, because it wasn't a single issue. 1992 was a very difficult year for us, because we were looking at a very major economic crisis. And many of the reforms that we did then, I think, served us very well. Then I would move to 1998, which was, for years we had this, ambivalence. I would actually say the ambivalence was really indecision on becoming a nuclear weapon power. I think it was important that we crossed that Rubicon, because today, in many ways, it enables us to deal with, competitive forces in a much more confident and assured manner. I would say thereafter it's been very much more evolutionary. It's hard to say that year there was a decisive change, but all in all, to me, the last 10 years have been important, and obviously I have a political partiality in making that statement, but I would still say why I think those 10 years have been important is, at home we are doing the reforms that we should, not just the ones we must. That, we're not saying our backs are to the wall, so let me do something. We are actually doing things, looking ahead, planning for the future, saying, if I put a semiconductor industry in place, it means this. If I do logistics, it means this. If I double the number of universities and colleges, that gives me a better place. Now, these are not changes which are compelled. These are changes which are strategized. And to me, that gives me a lot of hope about what we can do, because I can visibly see our domestic capacities increasing. These external is as the capacities grow, and as with the change of leadership, I think there's a much greater confidence in actually in addressing the world. And I would say this today: if you go around the world, let's be honest, in most countries, foreign policy is not popular. People don't want to do more. They don't. When foreign ministers meet, the common topic is how the budgets have shrunk. Okay, it's a common gripe of foreign ministers. We have to battle for your budget. Okay, I see the reverse in my country. There is an appetite to do more with the world. There is a sense of responsibility to the world. If you look at, for example, our first responder operations. We could take the view saying we are a $3,000 per capita country, so why should I send ships to the Gulf of Aden, or why should I send a responder team to an earthquake in Turkey, or whatever, depending on. But there is today, if I describe to you a sentiment in the country today. In my country today, foreign policy is popular. Dealing more with the world is popular. People feel both an obligation and a sense of pride about that. And that's for me been evolutionary, but it's human nature. Every 10 years you kind of look back and say, okay, where are we compared? And I think to me that's been hugely encouraging.
Well, Minister, it's a privilege to be with you today. It's been fascinating conversation. Thank you for the audience for your questions. But Mr. Minister, thank you for your answers. You are a star in the world, and I express the gratitude of all the audience. Thank you very much.
I would ask everyone to remain seated as our guests are leaving the stage, please. Thomas, would you like to? Okay, please remain seated as our guests are leaving. And there will be refreshments served outside.